There's a thing that a $70,000 murder contract buys, in theory, and there's a thing that this particular $70,000 murder contract actually bought, and the distance between those two things is the distance between what the Gambino crime family believed it was doing in the winter of 1999 and what actually happened in a Phoenix suburb in the early months of 2000. What the contract was supposed to buy was the death of Salvatore Gravano, who had admitted to 19 murders, served 5 years, and was now living openly in the Arizona desert under his own name, giving magazine interviews, taunting the organization whose boss he had destroyed, and operating a swimming pool installation company and an Italian restaurant, as though the 2.5 decades he had spent as one of the most violent figures in American organized crime were simply a chapter he had finished reading. What the contract actually bought was a cross-country surveillance operation that ran into problems with a fence line and an exposed apartment complex. A pair of hitmen who drove back to New York for Christmas before they could finish the job, and the discovery, by law enforcement, that the boss of the Gambino crime family had spent an amount of money his organization considered outrageous and gotten nothing at all to show for it. The boss who authorized that contract was not John Gotti, the flamboyant public figure in the custom suit whose image had defined the Gambino family for the better part of a decade. John Gotti was in federal prison serving the life sentence that Gravano's testimony had helped deliver. The boss who authorized the contract was Peter Gotti, John's older brother, a former sanitation worker who had retired from the New York City Department of Sanitation with a disability pension after hitting his head on the back of a garbage truck, and who had spent the better part of his adult life as the least remarkable figure in a family whose least remarkable member was still more remarkable than most. Peter Gotti would eventually be convicted of the conspiracy, sentenced to 25 years, and die in federal custody at the age of 81, having never come close to completing the assignment. Gravano, the man the contract was meant to kill, would be arrested before the hit team could reach him, sentenced to 20 years for running an ecstasy trafficking ring that sold up to 30,000 pills a week to teenagers in Phoenix area schools and dance clubs, and eventually released and returned to the city where the hitman had once photographed his office through a camera concealed in a car's front grille. The story of the $70,000 bounty that accomplished nothing is, at its center, the story of what happens when an organization built around one man tries to survive that man's disappearance, and when the obligation of revenge outlasts the capacity to deliver it. Drop where you are watching from in the comments below. Hearing from people all over the world is one of the best parts of doing this, and if you are new here and want more history like this delivered straight to you, subscribe now. Back to Brooklyn and a family whose trajectory was shaped by a world that was already in place before any of them were old enough to understand what they were looking at. The Bronx in October of 1939 was not a place that held great expectations for the children being born in its working-class neighborhoods. Peter Gotti arrived on October 15th of that year, the son of a family that would eventually include 13 children, and whose sons, all 5 of them, would find their way into the organizational world of the Gambino crime family. The family eventually relocated to East New York, Brooklyn, a neighborhood whose proximity to the structures of organized crime made the direction in front of young men from that background visible and, for some of them, irresistible. Peter's relationship to the family business was defined from the beginning by the quality that would shape his entire career: proximity to power without the possession of it. He joined the Gambino family as an associate around 1960, at approximately 21 years of age. His younger brother John was already moving through the organization with a speed and instinct that made him conspicuous. Peter moved at a different pace entirely. He simultaneously maintained legitimate employment with the New York City Department of Sanitation, a job that offered him cover for income and a paycheck, while he performed the kinds of low-level work that associates performed in those years. He drove for John. He drove for their brother Gene. He served as the caretaker of the Burge and Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park, Queens, the social club that functioned as the operational base for John Gotti's crew and the nerve center of that corner of the Gambino family's organizational life. Peter retired from the sanitation department sometime around 1979, after sustaining a head injury in a collision with the back end of a garbage truck. The injury produced a disability pension that gave him income without requiring him to sweep streets. It also produced, at the Bergen, a set of jokes that circulated among the members for years afterward, centered on the idea that the impact had been absorbed by the one part of Peter Gotti's anatomy that was guaranteed to sustain no lasting damage. John Gotti himself reportedly did not believe his older brother had the qualities necessary to be a member of Cosa Nostra. This assessment, shared or implied among the men around John, shaped Peter's position within the family in ways that were apparent to anyone who looked closely enough. Peter was not inducted as a full-made member of the Gambino family until 1988, when he was 49 years old. That was an exceptionally late age for the ceremony, one that reflected the organization's estimation of his qualities, rather than any particular journey he had taken to earn it. He was elevated to the rank of capo, captain of his own crew, in 1989. The last name that opened those doors was the same last name that limited what anyone expected once those doors had been opened. What that last name attached to, on the other end of the family tree, was something else entirely. John Gotti had seized control of the Gambino family in December of 1985, orchestrating the murder of his predecessor Paul Castellano outside Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street in Manhattan. The killing established John as the boss of the largest and most powerful criminal organization in the country. It also established him as a different kind of mob boss than the ones who had preceded him, visible, flamboyant, a presence in the newspapers and eventually on the television news, a man who wore expensive suits and silver-swept hair and gave the impression of enjoying the attention rather than tolerating it. The tabloids called him the Dapper Don. When a series of acquittals in the middle and late 1980s suggested the government's cases could not touch him, they added a second name, the Teflon Don. The names made him famous in a way that people in his position were not supposed to be, and the irony embedded in that fame was that it was both his greatest achievement and the foundation on which his eventual destruction was built. Salvatore Gravano was born on March 12, 1945, in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, a neighborhood whose proximity to the organizational infrastructure of the Gambino family made the path in front of him clear from early on. He was not a talker. He was a doer in the specific way that the organization valued doers, a man who proved his worth through action rather than words, and whose reputation within the family rested on a foundation of violence that the organization found useful and reliable. Gravano rose through the Gambino ranks with a thoroughness that distinguished him from most of his contemporaries. From street-level associate, he moved to soldier, then to captain, then to consigliere, the family's counselor and mediator, a position that required both organizational intelligence and personal standing. By the late 1980s, he was the underboss, second in command of the entire Gambino organization, the man who translated the boss's authority into operational direction for the captains and crews who made up the family's working structure. He was compact, physically capable, and understood to be dangerous in the particular way that the organization's culture defined danger, not as someone who lost his temper, but as someone who did not. The 19 murders he would eventually admit to were not anomalies in his career. They were the accumulated product of an organizational life in which violence was the instrument of discipline, and in which the man who administered that discipline most effectively earned the standing to rise. Among those 19 were the events of December of 1985, when Paul Castellano and his bodyguard, Thomas Bellotti, were shot dead outside Sparks Steakhouse, an act that cleared the way for John Gotti's ascension and positioned Gravano as his most trusted lieutenant in the years that followed. The two of them, boss and underboss, were effective together in a way that the Gambino family had not been in years. The organization's income, estimated at over $500 million annually at its height during the Gotti era, reflected the operational efficiency of a structure that functioned as its designers intended. The alliance between Gotti and Gravano was the engine of that efficiency, and it was an alliance that would produce, when it broke, the most consequential act of cooperation with federal authorities in the history of American organized crime prosecution. The Ravenite Social Club stood at 247 Mulberry Street in Manhattan's Little Italy neighborhood, and it was a place John Gotti had made his own in the years after he became boss. He held court there. He required his captains to appear weekly, to show respect and check in, a requirement that Gravano privately considered imprudent because it allowed federal agents to photograph and identify the family's membership from the street. Gotti would not hear of changing the arrangement. In November of 1989, pursuant to court orders signed by a federal judge, FBI agents planted listening devices in a second-floor apartment directly above the club, an apartment belonging to the widow of a former Gambino soldier. Gotti had begun using that apartment for meetings he considered too sensitive to conduct in the social club's main room below, apparently believing that a residential space offered a layer of protection that a mob club's common area did not. It did not. The recordings made in that apartment over the following months captured John Gotti discussing murders, directing extortions, allocating the proceeds of criminal operations, and doing all of it in his own voice, with an explicitness that removed the coded ambiguity that had protected organized crime defendants in earlier eras. Approximately 600 hours of material were eventually obtained. About 6 hours of those recordings were admitted as evidence at trial. On the night of December 11th, 1990, after a sealed indictment based on the recordings, FBI agent Bruce Moole watched through binoculars from a command post across the street as John Gotti arrived at the Ravenite in a Mercedes-Benz. When Gotti entered the club, Mao gave the signal to an arrest team that went through the front door minutes later. Gotti and Gravano were sitting in the back room, preparing to drink espresso when the agents arrived. Both were taken into custody. Frank Locascio, the family's consigliere, was arrested alongside them. Among the things the recordings captured was John Gotti speaking critically about Gravano, framing conversations in ways that positioned the underboss to absorb blame for criminal acts that both men had participated in together. Gravano heard those recordings after the arrest in the company of his lawyers. His response was to contact federal authorities. The words he reportedly used to describe his decision were precise. He wanted to go from his government to the government's government. Gravano cooperated formally in November of 1991. He had been, before his cooperation, the most senior-ranking member of the American Mafia ever to face prosecution while having admitted direct involvement in 19 murders. After his cooperation, he would become the most consequential organized crime witness in the history of federal prosecution in this country. The trial of John Gotti began in January of 1992 in the federal courthouse in Brooklyn, and it was everything the three acquittals that preceded it had not been. There was no anonymous sequestered jury that could be reached, no technicality that swallowed the government's case. There were hundreds of hours of recordings, and there was Gravano on the stand for 6 weeks, explaining to the jury what they were hearing, and who had said what to whom, and what it meant within the organizational world he had inhabited for his entire adult life. He admitted to involvement in 19 murders. He identified 10 of those murders as having been ordered or sanctioned by the man at the defense table. He explained the coded language on the recordings with a fluency that only a participant in those conversations could have provided. The jury had no difficulty. On April 2nd, 1992, they returned a verdict of guilty on all 13 counts, including 5 murders and racketeering. On June 23, 1992, John Gotti was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence Gravano received for his own admitted role in 19 murders was 5 years, under the terms of his cooperation agreement. He was released from federal custody in approximately 1994, having received credit for time already served. Within the Gambino family, the ratio that this produced, 19 dead, 5 years served, was not an abstraction or a legal technicality to be set aside and forgotten. It was a permanent entry in an organizational ledger that the men of the family carried with them in every discussion of Gravano's name for the decade that followed. The sentence was the wound, and the wound did not close. Whatever had to be done eventually would be done. The only question was when the organization would be in a position to do it. The Federal Witness Protection Program relocated Salvatore Gravano to Arizona in 1995 under the alias Jimmy Moran. a name unremarkable enough to vanish into a Phoenix suburb without attracting attention. The arrangement was supposed to be indefinite. The government's position was that a man who had admitted to 19 murders in an organization that held betrayal as its most serious offense and vengeance as a permanent organizational obligation would need a permanent shield between himself and the people who wanted to reach him. For approximately 2 years, Gravano accepted the terms of that shield. He left the program around 1997. He would later say that the restrictions it placed on his contact with family members who remained in New York were more than he was willing to sustain. He settled in Tempe, a college town that forms part of the sprawling metropolitan area around Phoenix, and he built a new life with a casualness that would eventually strike observers as difficult to reconcile with what he knew about the people looking for him. He continued to use his own name. He opened an Italian restaurant he called Uncle Sal's. He ran a swimming pool installation company. In 1997, the same year he departed the protection program, his memoir was published, written with author Peter Moss under the title Underboss, a detailed account of his career and the decision that had ended it. The book was a bestseller. He hired a publicist. He gave television interviews. In July of 1999, an Arizona Republic reporter located him in the Phoenix area and published a front-page story about his new life and his new business. The New York tabloids reprinted the story the following day. He gave an interview to Vanity Fair magazine around this period, in which his posture toward the people who wanted him dead was not conciliatory. If they sent a hit team down to Arizona, he said, he would kill them. They had better not miss, he added, because even if they got him, there would be a lot of body bags going back to New York. The Vanity Fair comments were widely reprinted and discussed. After the tabloids ran the Arizona Republic story, there was no longer any practical ambiguity about where Gravano could be found. The organizational intelligence problem that had complicated the assassination planning, the question of location, had been resolved, not by the Gambino family's own efforts, but by the newspaper business of a city 3,000 miles away. Within months, a team was on its way. The Gambino family that Peter Gotti began managing after John's imprisonment in the spring of 1992 was not the organization it had been when John ascended to the top in 1985. The family had been built around John's specific authority and the organizational discipline his presence imposed. With him gone, what remained was a structure of captains and crews whose loyalty had been personal as much as institutional, and whose confidence in the hierarchy depended on who was at its top. John had continued relaying orders from federal custody in the early years of his imprisonment, keeping the organizational hierarchy functioning through a combination of prison visits, carefully worded communications, and the standing he still commanded, even from a cell in Missouri. His son, John A. Gotti, known as Junior, served as acting boss from 1992 through 1999, holding the position in a way that at least partially fulfilled the father's intention of keeping the Gotti name at the head of the organization's structure. In January of 1998, Junior was indicted on federal racketeering charges that included allegations the organization had extracted over $1 million over a 6-year period from the owners of a Manhattan nightclub through extortion. Against his imprisoned father's reported wishes, Junior pleaded guilty. In 1999, he was sentenced to 6 years and 5 months in federal prison and fined $1 million. With Junior gone and John deteriorating from the throat cancer diagnosed in 1998, the family passed to the man who had spent 30 years demonstrating that he was unsuitable for exactly this role. Peter Gotti became acting boss in 1999. He operated with the support of 2 senior captains, Nicholas Carrazzo, known as Little Nick, and John D'Amico, known as Jackie Nose, who together with Peter formed what the organization referred to internally as the Committee, a collective leadership arrangement designed to compensate through collective judgment for what everyone involved understood Peter could not provide individually. The nickname his own men gave Peter Gotti during this period was the Dumbest Don. It was not said with affection. It reflected a genuine organizational assessment of his limitations, a verdict shared across the captains and associates of the family who found him incapable of commanding the kind of institutional respect that the position of boss had always required. He lacked his brother's charisma entirely. He lacked his brother's instinct for reading men and situations. He was, in the consensus of the men who served under him, a placeholder, a family name attached to an authority that resided elsewhere. What he was not, however, was someone who had forgotten the organizational debt that Gravano represented. The arithmetic of 5 years for 19 murders was as present for Peter as it was for every other man in the organization, and the Vanity Fair quote about body bags, reprinted in the New York papers in the summer of 1999 and absorbed into the conversation at every level of the Gambino family, was not something that the acting boss of the most famous crime family in America could leave unanswered without a cost to whatever authority he still possessed. In September of 1996, Peter Gotti had visited his brother at the federal facility in Springfield. The precise content of what was said between them that day is not fully established in the available record. What is documented is that the FBI later obtained recordings of John Gotti speaking to Peter about Gravano in terms that made his intentions clear. John described the plan to answer the man who had betrayed him. The direction that came out of those discussions, attributed in subsequent testimony to explicit instruction from John, was that the assignment should go to Thomas Carbonaro and another former member of Gravano's crew named Eddie Garafola, men who had worked alongside Gravano and understood the target in the specific way that proximity creates. The formal murder conspiracy, as the federal indictment would eventually charge it, ran from October of 1999 through May of 2000. That period opened after the Arizona Republic story, and the tabloid reprints removed the last ambiguity about where Gravano was living, and closed when circumstances intervened, in a way that no one at the Bergen or anywhere else in the Gambino family's organizational world had anticipated or could have planned for. For the selection of a partner to accompany him to Arizona, Carbonaro chose a man named Salvatore Mangiavigliano, known within the organization as Fat Sal, whose background made him, on paper, suited to the specific operational requirements of what they were being sent to do. Mangiavigliano was not primarily known as a killer. What he was, rather, was a technically sophisticated criminal, a man who had built and deployed computerized surveillance systems in the course of a career specializing in bank burglaries throughout the Northeast. He had used a hidden camera mounted inside a bank counting room to spy on employees and document their routines before executing a robbery. In the vocabulary of criminal tradecraft, he was an electronics expert, the kind of man whose skills were genuinely useful in a reconnaissance operation that needed to gather intelligence on a careful, dangerous target without being observed doing so. He was also, by various accounts, approximately 400 pounds in weight. This detail would not have appeared relevant to anyone assigning him to a covert surveillance operation in the Arizona desert, and it would become, in the story's aftermath, the element that most persistently attached itself to the retelling. The two men drove cross-country from New York to Phoenix in December of 1999 in a Mercury Grand Marquis. They had mounted a camera inside the vehicle's front grille, allowing them to conduct photographic surveillance of locations without the obvious presence of a man with a camera in his hands. They located Gravano's construction company office from the address information available in the Arizona Republic article. The newspaper had done that part of the work for them. What they found when they surveilled the construction office was a problem. The fencing that bordered the area created a geometry they determined would cause a bullet to ricochet unpredictably, rather than reach its target cleanly. The apartment complex where Gravano lived presented a different problem. It was too exposed, with too many sight lines and too many potential witnesses to make a clean approach and withdrawal possible. Neither primary location was workable in its present configuration. They obtained Arizona driver's licenses bearing fictitious names from the state's motor vehicle system. They acquired firearms through informal channels in Arizona, bypassing the documentation that licensed dealers would have required. They assessed their options for carrying out the killing and found both primary locations inadequate for a traditional shooting approach. Plans for alternatives were developed and discussed. A close-range shooting would require the killers to approach Gravano directly, and he was a man who had stated publicly that any hit team sent to find him should expect casualties going back to New York in quantity. A bomb or landmine device positioned along a route Gravano was known to travel offered physical distance from the action but required precise intelligence about his movements that the current reconnaissance had not yet established. Mangiavellano's technical experience made the explosive option something he was equipped to consider and attempt. Subsequent accounts described experiments with a device intended to spin and discharge shotgun shells along a predetermined path. The experiments did not produce a functional result. They drove back to New York for Christmas. The plan was to return in January of 2000, bring surveillance and listening equipment that would allow them to develop a detailed picture of Gravano's daily movements and use that picture to identify a location and a moment that the problems of fencing and exposure did not compromise. The target was living openly and without visible security in an American suburb. In principle, the task was not complicated. What it required was time, patience, and the willingness to return. Gravano had no idea that a Mercury Grand Marquis with a camera mounted in its grill had already spent days circling his office and his apartment complex, or that the organization he had testified against was systematically working through the technical problems that stood between its intentions and their execution. What Gravano was doing in Arizona while the Gambino family was preparing to kill him was not the careful, invisible existence that the government's protection program had offered him, and that the accumulated weight of his situation might reasonably have suggested. He was running a drug trafficking operation. His involvement had begun through his son Gerard, who had developed a friendship with a man named Michael Papa, a transplant from New York, who was operating a small-scale distribution ring in the Phoenix metropolitan area, selling ecstasy pills primarily at parties and rave events. Papa was also a founding member of a white supremacist gang called the Devil Dogs, an organizational affiliation that would not have appeared to have much in common with the Italian-American crime family world in which Gravano had spent his career, but which did not prevent a business relationship from developing once Gravano decided to extend the weight of his organizational experience to what Papa was building. Once that extension came, the operation expanded quickly into something considerably beyond what Papa had constructed on his own. Weekly sales grew to between 20,000 and 30,000 pills, sold at prices up to $25 each, with profits estimated at over $300,000 per week by some accounts. The ring targeted teenagers at Phoenix area schools and rave music venues throughout the metropolitan area. Gravano's wife Deborah, his son Gerard, and his daughter Karen were all involved in some capacity. Arizona Attorney General Janet Napolitano would later describe the prosecution that followed as one of the largest and most successful drug prosecutions in the state's history. Phoenix police had been investigating Papa and the ring as a separate matter, an investigation that had nothing to do with the Gambino family, nothing to do with the murder conspiracy being prepared in New York, and nothing to do with the Mercury Grand Marquis that had circled Gravano's business the previous December. The investigation simply followed the evidence it had, and the evidence led where it led. On the morning of February 24th, 2000, police arrested Gravano, his wife, his son, and his daughter, along with approximately 35 other members of the ring. Gravano was brought before a Maricopa County judge and set on a $5 million cash bond. He told the judge when he appeared before her that he had never run from a case in his life. For the hit team that had been preparing to return to Arizona with its surveillance equipment and its plans for the second phase of the reconnaissance, the arrest changed the arithmetic of the entire operation in a single morning. Gravano was no longer a target accessible at a construction company office with problematic fencing or at an apartment complex with too many sightlines. He was in custody in the Arizona criminal justice system with a $5 million bond keeping him there. The organizational logic that had justified the $70,000 expenditure, the visible, taunting presence of the most dangerous turncoat in the organization's history, living freely in a desert city and giving interviews to national magazines, had been removed by the state of Arizona acting on entirely unrelated grounds. The hit team had no body to show for what it had done and what it had spent. Peter Gotti had no body to show for what he had authorized. The job that Peter Gotti had approved, funded, and monitored had produced nothing of organizational value. Gravano was alive, in custody, and likely to remain in the Arizona justice system for years. The $70,000 had purchased a car ride, some hotel nights, a set of Arizona driver's licenses with false names, some black market firearms, and a surveillance device that did not function as intended. Peter Gotti's response to this outcome was to complain about it to a Gambino captain named Michael DeLeonardo, known within the organization as Mikey Scars. He told DeLeonardo that he had spent $70,000 on the Gravano job and had no body to show for it. He went further, questioning whether Carbonaro and Mangiaviano had actually made the trip to Arizona at all, suggesting the possibility that the money had been collected without the assignment being executed. The complaint was explicit about the dollar figure, and explicit about what the dollar figure was supposed to have purchased. What Peter Gotti did not know, in the moment he made that complaint, was that DeLeonardo would eventually become a government informant, and what DeLeonardo's memory retained with particular clarity was the specific number that Peter had expressed frustration about spending. The path to law enforcement's full knowledge of the plot came through a different channel first. Mangiaviano, the electronics expert who had driven to Phoenix in the Mercury Grand Marquis, was subsequently arrested on federal bank burglary charges related to the career he had been pursuing alongside his organizational affiliations. Facing serious federal time on those charges, he became a cooperating witness. The account he provided of the Arizona reconnaissance, the camera in the grill, the problem with the fencing at the construction office, the difficulty with the apartment complex's exposure, the Christmas return to New York, and the plans that had not been executed before the target's arrest made them unnecessary, came out of that cooperation, and it came out in June of 2002, 16 months after Gravano's arrest. June of 2002 was the same month that John Gotti died. He died on June 10th at the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. He was 61 years old and had been fighting throat cancer for 4 years. His death did not end the legal accounting that was coming for his brother. If anything, it clarified what was left when the organization's originating authority was gone. Peter Gotti was indicted in June of 2002 on federal racketeering and extortion charges. Those charges addressed the Gambino family's control of operations on the Brooklyn and Staten Island waterfronts and in the construction industry during his tenure. The indictment also carried an allegation that the family had attempted to extort a well-known actor, a claim that brought the case a degree of tabloid attention that previous organized crime prosecutions had not always generated. In August of 2003, a separate indictment expanded the charges to include the conspiracy to murder Gravano. Peter Gotti and 5 other Gambino family members were named in it. The evidence assembled for the conspiracy trial was, by any measure, direct. There were videotape recordings of prison conversations between the Gotti brothers, including John's recorded statement about answering the man who had betrayed him. There was the testimony that DeLeonardo would provide about Peter's complaint regarding the $70,000 and the absent body. There was the account of Mangiaviano's cooperation, which had established the operational details of the December 1999 trip in substantial documentary form. The defense argument that Peter Gotti had been unfairly targeted because of his last name, and that he was not the man prosecutors claimed he was, confronted the fact that the government's most important evidence was Peter Gotti's own words, recorded and recalled by people who had been in the room when he said them. Peter Gotti's first federal conviction came in March of 2003, when a jury found him guilty on the waterfront racketeering and construction extortion charges from the earlier indictment. On April 15, 2004, Judge Frederick Block sentenced him to 9 years and 4 months in federal prison, with credit for the time he had already served since his 2002 arrest. He was not finished with the federal courts. On December 22, 2004, a second jury found Peter Gotti guilty of racketeering conspiracy, including the specific conspiracy to murder Gravano. Thomas Carbonaro was convicted alongside him. The trial that produced that verdict had featured the kinds of evidence that organized crime prosecutions had historically depended on informants, cooperating witnesses, and recordings, combined with the ironic detail that the man whose death the conspiracy had sought was alive, having been saved not by government protection or personal vigilance, but by his own decision to traffic ecstasy pills to Arizona teenagers. On July 27th, 2005, Judge Richard Casey sentenced Peter Gotti to 25 years in federal prison for the second set of charges. Judge Casey described the Gambino family's organizational purpose in the course of the sentencing remarks as being to terrorize, extort, maim, and murder in the pursuit of illegal profits. He dismissed the arguments offered by defense counsel, who urged a lighter sentence based on the client's age and declining health. Peter Gotti, who was 66 years old and had arrived in the courtroom using a cane, showed no visible reaction when the sentence was pronounced. His projected release date was set at September of 2032. In 2019, his lawyers sought early release on compassionate grounds. Court papers described his condition as including heart problems, dementia, blindness in one eye, and cancer. Manhattan federal judge Colleen McMahon denied the application. Her written decision did not contest the medical facts. What it said instead was that Gotti had headed one of the most vicious and violent organized crime organizations in New York for a number of years, that the Gambino family had earned millions of dollars from the extortion of the construction industry during his tenure, and that he had personally ordered the death of a government cooperator. She did not believe that his sentence should be reduced, notwithstanding his compromised medical condition. Peter Gotti died on February 25, 2021, at the Federal Medical Center in Butner, North Carolina. He was 81 years old. He had served more than 17 years in federal custody. His brother John had died in a similar federal medical facility in Springfield, Missouri. 19 years earlier, Salvatore Gravano pleaded guilty to drug trafficking charges in Arizona and in New York in June of 2001. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. He was released in September of 2017, having served approximately 16 years. He lives now in the Phoenix area. He is on lifetime federal parole. He hosts a podcast and maintains an active public presence, including a social media profile. He was in his late 70s at the time of this writing. Thomas Carbonaro was convicted alongside Peter Gotti in December of 2004. Salvatore Mangiaviano, whose cooperation with federal authorities had helped establish the operational record of the Arizona trip, is understood by various accounts to be living outside the United States, his citizenship situation having remained complicated since the original deportation that preceded his return to the country by jet ski from Canada. The story of the $70,000 bounty is, when its pieces are assembled in order, a story about the cost of organizational obligation outlasting organizational capacity. John Gotti had built a family around his own presence and authority and willingness to be seen. When he was removed from that structure, what remained was the shape of what he had built without the force that had given the shape its meaning. The obligation to answer Gravano had been written into the family's institutional identity from the moment the 5-year sentence was announced in 1992. For a decade, the organization that carried that obligation lacked both the clear authority and the operational conditions to act on it. When those conditions appeared, briefly in the autumn of 1999, the organization moved. What it moved with was a former sanitation worker in the boss's seat, a captain known primarily as a killer, and a 400-pound electronics expert who had entered the country illegally on a jet ski, and whose operational cover in the Arizona desert would later generate, in the accounts of people who were not trying to be funny, a sustained quality of dark comedy that the underlying purpose of the mission did not invite. The $70,000 bought a reconnaissance that identified problems it could not solve, plans that could not be executed before the target was removed by a completely unrelated set of events, and a complaint about the expenditure that was remembered precisely by a man who would eventually tell federal prosecutors exactly what he had been told and exactly what number had been involved. Peter Gotti and John Gotti both died in federal medical facilities in different states, 19 years apart. The man who sent them both there was released from an Arizona prison in September of 2017 and returned to Phoenix, where the hitman had once spent December of 1999 trying to figure out what to do about the fencing near his office. The Gambino family that John Gotti had led, that had generated over $500 million annually at its height, and had been called by federal prosecutors the most powerful criminal organization in the country, was a diminished and fragmented structure by the time Peter Gotti died. The conditions that had made it what it was, the specific combination of a charismatic and ruthless leader, an effective operational second, and an organizational discipline that had survived multiple prosecutions across multiple decades, had not survived the removal of the man around whom they had been constructed. What the $70,000 bought in the final accounting was a documented paper trail, a set of convictions, a 25-year sentence for the acting boss, and a permanent entry in the record of American organized crime as the murder contract that cost more than it was ever going to deliver, and accomplished nothing at all except the legal destruction of the man who authorized it. The disability pensioner from Queens died in federal custody in North Carolina, having spent his final years trying to persuade a federal judge that his health was too poor to sustain what his crimes had earned him. The judge, reviewing the record of what those crimes had been, concluded that they had been serious enough to sustain it. He was right about one thing, in the end, though it was not the thing he had spent $70,000 trying to prove. The rat who destroyed his family was still alive when Peter Gotti died. He is still alive now. The body bags, as it turned out, went to North Carolina and to Missouri, not to New York.